Welcome to another episode of the Battlefields and Bourbon Podcast, the podcast where we sit and sip, talk all things Civil War history and bourbon and whiskey. I'm Jack, joined as always by my co-host Elijah. Today we are coming to you from the historic Bell House in beautiful downtown Winchester, Virginia. The Bell House is preserved and maintained by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, managing entity of the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields National Historic District, the official sponsor of the Battlefields and Bourbon Podcast. If you like what you hear and you want to support the podcast, consider becoming a member of the Battlefields Foundation. Every dollar you give to support battlefield preservation here in the Shenandoah Valley in turn helps supports the podcast. You can do that by going to www.shenandoahatwar.org. That's Shenandoah, ATWAR.org. Go to click Ways to Give, and on there you'll find links to membership. Membership start as low as $35 and range to however high you'd like to give. So if you want to support the podcast, consider becoming a member of the Battlefields Foundation.
This episode is also brought to you by the Blue and Gray Education Society. Discover America's premier Civil War education company, the Blue and Gray Education Society. Founded in 1994 and now celebrating over 30 years of operation, their mission is to educate and preserve American Civil War heritage. Their motto says it best, revealing our past for our future. Over the past 3 decades, the Blue and Gray Education Society has accomplished significant preservation projects thanks to the support of its dedicated members. Highlights include installing and refurbishing hundreds of historical signs at battlefields across the nation, including Perryville, Cedar Creek, Kernstown, and North Anna, purchasing and installing cannons at Civil War sites like Dalton and Pelham's Corner, and restoring 3 flags inside Lincoln's presidential box at Ford's Theater. These projects and many more were made possible by membership dues and generous donations. The Blue and Gray Education Society also offers unmatched Civil War tours led by authors and subject matter experts. These immersive experiences allow you to walk the battlefields and explore areas that no other tour company dares to venture. They have also published several influential books, including the official National Geographic Civil War Traveler's Guide and the award-winning Revolutionary War Guidebook. Visit their website at blueandgrayeducation.org or connect with them on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. Join the Blue and Gray Education Society today and help preserve our nation's history for future generations.
Exciting episode we have today, but before we get started, let's get our glasses full. Elijah, what are we sipping on today?
So we've got a Virginia-made product today, courtesy of our guest, Mr. Jarred. We've got a J.H. BARDS Spirit Company Rye Whiskey, and this is a wheated rye, so predominant grain obviously being rye, being a rye whiskey, but there's wheat in the mash bill instead of corn. J.H. BARDS is based out of Blacksburg, Virginia. Started back in 2016, so this is a relatively new distillery to the Commonwealth, and something that my first time trying, and I'm sure everyone else's first time trying as well, so I'm excited to try something new to Virginia and hopefully become a fan of. As far as history goes on the place, looks like Bourbon and Rye Drinking Society is what the acronym for BARDS is, and then the founders, Jason Hudson and Jason Hardy, JH being that part of the name there. And the rye whiskey that we've got here is 65% rye, 18% wheat, and 14% malted barley. So this will be pretty interesting to try. It doesn't say an age statement on it, so we'll kind of have to just taste that to find
Good pop.
out.
What's the proof there?
90 proof.
90 proof. So, and what's the percentage of rye again?
65.
Wow.
65, yeah. So as far as a rye whiskey is concerned, I would consider that a lower rye mash bill because generally speaking, they're a 95.5 or on the higher end. So anything in your upper 50s, lower 60s is generally a low rye whiskey. Yeah,
sitting in the room with us today is Jarred Marlowe again, the the membership director now.
That's correct.
For the Blue and Gray Education Society, as well as Aaron Civil War Travels himself, Aaron Seaver. He's sitting in the room and he'll come in with questions and I'm sure comments on the whiskey here shortly. It's another exciting episode we have, but gentlemen, what do we get off the nosing?
A lot of cereal grain on that one. It's probably a younger whiskey, I guess, just because they have only been out for a few years, but there's an interesting flavor profile to that, and it's got obviously your typical rye spice, but there's almost like a black licorice in there somewhere.
Man,
Yeah, I
that
know
is
you'll like it. I knew as soon as I smelled it, I was like, Jack's gonna love this.
just smells like a distillery. This
Yeah,
is
let's get
what
that.
it's supposed to smell like.
Definitely smells like a distillery.
The musty dusty that you like.
Yeah, I love that. All right, let's give it a tasting.
Already.
Yeah, no, I definitely get like
Wow.
a black licorice on that one, which is like very interesting because I've never picked that up so distinctly on a whiskey before.
I was gonna say, to me, it kind of tastes like a bit of Scotch at first.
Yeah.
You know, almost kind of like a Scotch. But like the more you get into it, it's you can tell the sweetness comes from the wheat, and I'm even getting some berries on the very back end of it.
Yeah, no,
But
that's definitely there too.
That's just me.
Yeah, I definitely, as soon as you said black licorice, I'm getting a licorice hint in there. Definitely a fruit, fruity berries type of thing. The sweetness, yeah, definitely from the wheats coming in, but then you get that rye, and I don't know, it's almost more of a complex, unique flavor than you do with your higher percentage rye whiskeys. And I like this. I like this a lot. This is really good. Jared, this is good. Thank you for bringing this on.
Yeah,
I'm
no
with
problem.
you. I got the Scotch.
Yeah.
I've never had
The
Scotch,
Scotch
so I
thought.
can't.
Right away.
You'll get
but
it eventually.
It's good. It's good.
Yeah.
I like this one. I wasn't 100% sure. You kind of scared me with it earlier. But yeah. This is
I get
good.
that root beer. Like, I'm going back
There it
to our.
is.
Well, we haven't had
Like
it
a
on the show,
sassafras type
but a
of deal.
sassafras type of.
Yeah.
I'm going back to Devil's Dues root beer bourbon
Yeah,
they
yeah.
did. We haven't had it on the show, but we still have it on the shelf. And we sip from it time to time, and I
do
get some
pick
of that.
up. Yeah.
Sassafras for sure.
Definitely.
And it's interesting too because generally speaking, with those lower rye mash bills for a rye whiskey, I tend to pick out it's like an apple note, but that is not in this one at all. It's that Scotch, like the malty.
I don't get an apple.
No, not in this one, and it's interesting. But I do like that. That's really good for a local product and something that, I mean, I haven't heard of until now. But I'm glad to have them on the show because this is awesome.
And speaking of a malt, they do have a bourbon, and they do have a malt whiskey, and they also have a maple whiskey, I believe.
Looking at their website, yeah, they've got an 84 proof bourbon, 60 proof maple whiskey. So that one's probably a little more mellow just for your casual sipping and mixed drinks and that sort of thing, as well as a Virginia single malt whiskey coming in at 92 proof.
This is in Blacksburg,
Yes.
and is it just an operation where they have a little storefront, or is it
They-
an experience where I can go there and taste?
They just moved to a new tasting room. It's a couple blocks from the Tech's campus. So
Wow.
it's in downtown Blacksburg now.
I'm gonna have to check this out if I ever
Road
have a
trip.
reason to
Yeah,
go to
it's
Tech.
road trip.
Yeah.
Yeah,
This is exciting.
They operated for a few years outside of Blacksburg and kind of like a makeshift setup, but they've sent. I think they moved back there in May or June, but they moved to an official storefront and a tasting room, and I believe they make all the stuff in house there downtown as well.
Virginia makes good stuff. I
They
feel
do.
like Virginia does, like when you're talking old school bourbon and whiskeys, obviously Kentucky's going to take it home. But when you're looking at like who's new to the scene and your micro distilleries, it's like Virginia's got it going. And it's
Catoctin Creek,
Catoctin, Mount Defiance, Ironclad,
Ragged Branch,
Bowman.
Tarnished Truth.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, a lot of these brands are like,
And then
I mean,
this dessert, this is a great whiskey. I love it.
Yeah, no, I hope people check them out because this is impressive.
Yeah, and I normally rate the bottle. Pretty simple bottle. Got going there.
Basic,
Pretty simple, simple label, but they're new. I like they had a little touch for the sticker that goes around the cork there. Had a pretty good cork pop to it. We didn't hit on that at the beginning. It was a good cork pop, but so give that a 10. It's a pretty good product all around. I love it.
Yeah, no, I hope that they hopefully soon start to put out a little bit of older product, and I think that'll really step their game up because I mean, this being I'm sure young, although not age stated, it's really good for what it is, and if they put out something a little older, I mean that's gonna be insane.
Yeah, but I mean, when we talked with the folks down at Weldon Mills, the science behind a smaller barrel being able to speed up what the aging process is.
Yeah, and I'm
is
not sure what
probably.
their
I mean, we don't know what they're
cooperages-
doing, but I can
Yeah.
assume it's something similar because you're getting the color, you're getting a little bit of, maybe some age in the flavor, but it doesn't taste super young. But like you said, it would be definitely interesting to try a larger batch that's older.
Yeah.
Yeah, why not? So, With that being said, we've got a great pour in our glass. Hopefully you all have something in your cup at home. With that being said, Jarred, what are we talking about today?
Well, we're going to talk about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart because it's where I grew up, it's where I grew up and where I live now, and that is Danville, Martinsville, and kind of the end of the Civil War, that last week leading up to Lee's surrender, because I think a lot of attention gets focused on Appomattox because, that's where the actual surrender happened. But there was a lot going on in Danville and Martinsville during that last week. Danville gets the focus of the attention because that's where Davis was with the capital of Richmond falling and them coming to Danville. But there's an interesting piece about Martinsville that I didn't learn until I moved there about 8 years ago that people don't really know about, and they've never made the connection between Danville and Martinsville. So that's what I hope to do here today, and hope to share with you a pretty interesting story that often gets overlooked because it's not at Appomattox.
Yeah, so with that, we're talking the last week of the war, basically, in 1865.
Correct.
In Virginia.
In Virginia. Sorry.
Virginia.
Thank you, Aaron, for coming in on that. It's a good point to bring up. A lot of people focus just on the immediate surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, or maybe just following Lee's exact route from, Petersburg to Appomattox. But when we're talking about, the Confederate government itself, Davis leaving, what's that path look like, as well as south of the Confederates themselves on the move, what's happening in this area. This area of Virginia, we were talking about this before recording, known locally and regionally and during the war sense as the South Side of Virginia, Southside Virginia.
Correct.
It's a large area. You can't cluster them together. We were talking, I thought Farmville was close to this area, and it's not. It's not close to Danville or Martinsville. So it's a large area, but it's a unique area, plays a critical role. If we can probably, before we dive into this last week of the war in Virginia, previously, what does this area see specifically throughout the war leading up to this?
During the war, they're pretty much untouched. They don't see any battles. They don't have any armies coming through for the most part. Danville is very much a supply center for the Confederate Army, and I would argue one of Lee's main suppliers of the Army of Northern Virginia, especially in the latter parts of the war, because if you look at where he is with the Overland Campaign and then with moving to Petersburg, those places have direct access to Danville. And especially moving into 1864 with the burning of the Shenandoah Valley and that no longer being a viable option for food sources, Danville becomes it. Danville, at any point in time from 1863 to 1865, has 500,000 bread rations and 1 million meat rations ready to go at any time.
Wow.
So one of the South's largest supply centers, there is a there's not an arms factory there, but there's a large armory there, which would actually blow up a few days after the surrender. But there are arms in Danville. But as far as the war itself goes, Danville goes pretty much untouched. They're loyal supporters of the South. They are some of the first to send out soldiers to fight. They send out several companies from Danville, but they don't see battles. They're not really near anything, being in the central and southern part of the states. Whereas the war pretty much happens in Richmond and Fredericksburg and the Shenandoah Valley, and even some instances out in southwest Virginia towards Abingdon and Bristol out that way. So if you kind of imagine like an arc around Danville, like things happen all around the arc, but nothing really happens there. And then I guess the closest they get to action in Danville is in 1864 with the Lynchburg battle with Early and Hunter. I think it's the closest action they see until the very end, which we'll discuss here in a little bit.
It was also a pretty big hospital hub.
Hospital and prison.
Yeah.
Danville was big on tobacco. It was one of the area's biggest tobacco markets, especially with the Richmond and Danville Railroad. Danville turned into a large tobacco market. So they had all these warehouses downtown, and they still do. If you go to Danville today in downtown Danville, you can see all these warehouses. They're still there. They've just been turned into different things. So when Richmond starts to go into decline, and the Confederates are looking for a place to store these prisoners, they move them to Danville. And Danville at one time had around anywhere from 7,000 to 10,000 Union prisoners of war. And so much so that so many of them died while in Danville that they also have a national cemetery in Danville.
Wow.
Which is solely, obviously, for Union forces.
And that's crazy, too, because I know before the episode, we were kind of, talking about a map of Danville, trying to find a map of Danville for the episode cover picture. You would think for something that's so, rations and an armory.
Critical, yeah.
Yeah, critical to the war effort, that they would have at least mapped that out, somewhat extensively as far as, the role that it plays in the war.
Right. And you'll see a few maps from that era, but they're not like city overviews. There'll be a focus on a certain aspect, like where the warehouses were or where certain people lived, and it doesn't give you a glimpse of the entire city, which was small at that point. But it doesn't give you a glimpse of
street by street,
or the layout. The most comprehensive map I've seen is a map of Danville's defenses, which was in very rough shape, and they kind of drew out where they put cannons on bluffs and tried to dig earthworks, but that's in such rough shape now that there's nothing that can be salvaged from it, really.
Yeah. So when it comes to the last week of the war, what are we looking at with this area? Why do you feel it's so prominent and important to talk about? I mean, lead us right into it.
Right. Well, I think, or when talking about this area, I always like to tell people a story first. And that is on the night of April 8th, 1865. So this is the day before Lee surrendered. Jefferson Davis and his entire Confederate government are now in Danville. And they are sitting around the dining room table of the Major William T. Sutherland, who is the most prominent resident in Danville. And they're having dinner, and the mood that evening was very light, because Danville was never meant to be the permanent capital. It was meant to be a stopping point on to the very next thing, and they were trying to figure out what that next thing was. Davis moved it to Danville in part because he wanted to show people that the capital was not leaving Virginia and the Confederacy was still strong. But Danville was a serviceable capital, but it was not meant to be the permanent capital. But the mood around the dining room table that night in the mansion was very light. They were talking about what was next and talking about the state of things. They had been in a rough spot before. This whole entire war, their backs had been against the wall. They weren't supposed to win, but yet here they are 4 years into it, and they're still fighting. They still had two major armies in the field with Lee and Johnston. There was still hope for this thing. Ever since Davis had been in Danville, though, he had not heard from Lee. The last message he got from Lee was on the morning of April 2nd, 1865, in which Lee told him that he was giving up Petersburg and Davis needed to leave Richmond as soon as possible. And that was the last Davis had heard from Lee. So Davis had sent out a courier by the name of John Wise. John Wise was a VMI cadet. He didn't fight at Newmarket because he was either sick or injured. I can't remember which one. But Davis used Wise, and his father being, of course, the former governor of Virginia, Henry Wise, and also a general himself. Davis sends John Wise out to find Robert E. Lee and get a status report because, like I said, he hasn't heard from Lee now in 6 days, and that's his main commander. He needs an update. So Wise rides out, finds Lee, gets a report, and rides back. And on the evening of April 8th, Wise arrives in Danville, and he comes up to the back of the house where they are, and he's greeted by the homeowner, Major William T. Sutherland. Sutherland brings him into the dining room, and Wise says that he has a message for President Davis. And Davis says, that whatever Wise needs to say can be said in front of who all was in the room, because at that time it was Davis and his cabinet. John C. Breckinridge, George Trenholm, Secretary of the Treasury, John Reagan, Stephen Mallory, just his entire cabinet is at this table. And Wise delivers the report that things are looking very dire for Lee, and Lee cannot continue to fight with the way things are going. And you can almost feel the air sucked out of the room at that point. And Davis asked the hard question, well, how much time does Lee have left? And Wise says, well, when I left him, he had about 24 to 48 hours. And, of course, the next day, Lee would end up signing the surrender papers at Appomattox. But it's interesting to me how in Danville, the mood goes from being, not necessarily happy, but okay, what do we need to do next? What's the next step in this? How do we keep this thing going? To there's now no hope. Our main army is surrendering, and we can't go back to where we were because that's, now occupied by Union forces, and we now have a Union army led by Sherman coming up from the south. So I always like to imagine being in the room that night and just feeling the air just sucked out of the room, knowing that there was going to be no hope going forward.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, and I mean, that's just, it's such an impactful moment, and it's huge.
Right.
Do you have any idea what Davis wanted the capital to be in Virginia, or he was still thinking that over at that time? And
right. So I guess the next place we need to go is why Davis ended up in Danville. So morning of April 2nd, 1865, Davis is sitting in church when he gets a message that Lee is about to leave Petersburg. He cannot hold on any longer, so he is going to leave Petersburg. So therefore, Davis needs to evacuate Richmond as soon as possible. So Davis leaves the church service, goes back, and him and his government officials start loading up everything they can onto trains. And the only train line that was still serviceable was the Richmond and Danville Railroad. So the only rail line that was not cut or didn't lead you right into Grant's forces was the one heading west or southwest towards Danville. So being that was the only one left, that was the one they headed on. So they loaded up the entire government, the entire treasury, all the government officials, their spouses. They packed what they could in trunks. And about 12 hours later, this huge train convoy starts leaving Richmond and heading to Danville. Now, it's a very slow process. They don't end up getting there until afternoon on the 3rd, which is the Monday. So it takes them about 12 to 16 hours to travel by train to get there. So if you can imagine, being cramped up on a train car for that long with people, because it was just they had to stop and do rail repairs. The line wasn't cut, but it was damaged. They had to stop and do repairs. So they get to Danville on April 3rd, and Davis knew that Danville was going to be a good place because the people there were very friendly towards him. When he arrives at the train station, there's a crowd of people there to meet him. He comes into essentially a hero's welcome. The people there still have optimism and hope for what's going on. They're happy that he chose Danville. I'm not sure if they knew the circumstances fully, but they were happy that he chose Danville. So he comes off. He rides a carriage up to the most prominent house in town, and geographically, it's just on a very high point, and that's the house owned by Major Sutherland. And he essentially just sets up his government from there. He knows that Danville, like I said before, is not going to be the official Confederate capital going forward, but it has enough infrastructure in place where he can use it for now until he figures out Plan B, or I guess in this case Plan C, because with Plan B being Danville. The first thing that Davis truly does after he gets there and he settles down and gets his strength back from the train ride was Davis takes a tour of Danville. He had never been to Danville before, but he wanted to see what was there, what was what he could use to help defend himself, because keep in mind, the entire Confederate government's there, the entire Confederate treasury's there, and there are armies all on the move. There's one below him, there's one east of him, then they're coming, and he wants to know what defenses Danville has. Well, he gets there and he finds out that Danville really doesn't have anything. They have some cannons on some bluffs near the river, but
That's it.
they're pretty much unguarded. We mentioned that Danville was a prisoner of war, or had lots of prisons for prisoners of war. In 1864, they tried to get the prisoners to dig earthworks around the city to make it more defensible. And that was going well for a few weeks until the prisoners escaped. So they had to go then round up the prisoners, which several prisoners have it in their diary that they escaped and were captured in Martinsville, which was then known as Henry Courthouse, and brought back to Danville. But to not risk a prison escape again, they quit digging the earthworks, which if you go to Danville today, you can still see some of the earthworks that are there that they dug. But otherwise, Danville was, not defended, other than a few Confederate soldiers who were serving as prison guards and the home guard. That was it. So Davis comes into Danville with not high hopes, but he knows that Danville is going to work, but he's also concerned that if things get hot and hairy very quickly, he is not going to survive, essentially.
Now, where else do they have in mind to move to? Because you can't really go southward. That's
He at that time there was a small rail line heading west of Danville, which would lead you to Martinsville, and there were some turnpikes heading towards modern day like Hillsville, Wytheville, that area. But the only true serviceable rail line was a rail line that was just completed called the Piedmont Railroad, and which headed south to Greensboro. So he did have an escape route south to Greensboro, and that was his, I guess in his head a plan C. But
because he ends up in Charlotte.
Yeah, his wife is actually in Charlotte. Long before all of this happens. He sends her to Charlotte, I think it's in February or March.
Yeah, he sent her pretty early.
Yeah, he sends his wife down there, and he sends a lot of things with her so she'll be comfortable, because he kind of got the sense that Lee couldn't hold on too much longer. So Davis's wife is actually in Charlotte. But the Piedmont Railroad that goes from Danville to Greensboro, you can change lines at Greensboro and then head south towards Charlotte, and then that opens you up all the way to essentially New Orleans.
But even still, that's under Union control at that time too, is it not?
Right. Sherman is lurking.
Yeah.
He's not 100% sure where Sherman is. He knows he's, or I think the last Davis heard, he was crossing the border into North Carolina, and Johnson's forces were in the Raleigh area getting ready to combat that.
So he's trying to sneak past them.
Right. So if you know much about geography, Raleigh is kind of towards the eastern side of the state, where Greensboro is dead in the center, and Charlotte's kind of slightly towards the southwest. So he thought maybe he could
Thread the needle
and get around there. And once he makes his escape, he kind of does for a while. But that was kind of in his head. If things get hot and hairy here and I have to leave, I can always go to Greensboro, which is what he ends up doing.
Right. And then he's also kind of, when Wise shows up to tell him the news of Lee's army and all that stuff, putting on this false sense of confidence or defiance, whatever you want to call it. But meanwhile, the fact that he's sending his wife southward tells you everything you need to know, because what you care about most, you will protect the most. And the fact that he's sending her south well before anything else ever takes place, that tells you he knows in his heart of hearts that that's what's going on.
And Charlotte was still a very strong Confederate point at that time in the war. I think Aaron did a video on Charlotte.
Yeah, there's an Aaron Civil War Travels video.
Yeah, so check that out. But Davis knew that Charlotte was going to be a pretty strong point, so and I don't know why he doesn't send the rest of the cabinet's family there when things go down, but on the train with him to Danville, you have wives and children and all sorts of things. So he comes to Danville by himself.
Tries to minimize the severity of the situation.
Right.
by at least protecting what he cares about most, while keeping the others as collateral, just to maintain that facade that everything's okay, or it will be okay.
Yeah, entering Danville with confidence.
Yeah.
He's getting, like Jared said, the hero's welcome.
Right.
And not showing it as, not coming in as a defeated entity, but coming in and saying, hey, we had a setback.
Right.
Yeah, if you show up with a full wagon, I mean, it looks like, okay, everybody's here.
We're still good. Right. We got provisions here. We got,
And again, that's why it was important, too, in his mind that he not leave Virginia.
Yeah.
I'm still in the same state. Like, I had to change cities, but I'm still in the same state.
At the very bottom of the state.
Right.
You are there.
This is just a setback.
I am on the border, but I'm still in Virginia.
Yeah. So we've got a nice, what is this, April 8th story of Davis. So what are we looking at, kind of restarting our timeline here of this week across this Danville Martinsville area?
To establish a timeline, I think it's very interesting to look at the correspondence between guys like PGT Beauregard and Joe Johnston. At that time, Beauregard was put in charge of all the forces that were in central and North Carolina and southwest and south side Virginia. So Beauregard hears rumors that there is a Union raid coming from Tennessee. And he knows that they're probably going to be cutting rail lines and getting rid of supplies. So he sends a message to Johnston, who, keep in mind, is in Carolina at this time, getting ready to face Sherman. And he says, hey, of course, this is the paraphrased version of the official record. But he says, hey, I hear that there's a Union raid coming from Tennessee, and they're probably going to start burning supplies and getting rid of, any help to Lee's army they can. Should I send some troops to Danville to guard it? And Johnston sends back, not really. If you see somebody coming, then send somebody. But right now, it's not really a top priority. And that was on April the 1st. On April the 4th, Jefferson Davis, keep in mind he's been in Danville 2 days at this point, asked Beauregard, hey, have you heard from Lee? Because I haven't heard anything. Like, have you heard from Lee? Where is he? Do I need to be worried? So Beauregard at this point sends a message to Johnson and says, hey, I know that you're gearing up to fight Sherman, but I need troops here in Danville. The entire government's here. The entire treasury's here. Everything that the Confederacy has is in Danville, and it is completely unguarded. Can you send me troops? Johnson sends back, well, actually, I just recalled some troops from the Lynchburg area. You can have them. Mm-hmm. So there's actually troops heading south at that point. Once they get right outside of Martinsville, Johnson changes his mind. I don't know if he received a report from Sherman that things were going to happen sooner than he thought, but he sends a message to Colonel James Wheeler, not to be confused with fighting Joe Wheeler, but Colonel James Wheeler, who's a Confederate cavalry colonel, and he says, hey, forget that Martinsville, Danville stuff. I need you in Raleigh right away. So Johnson tells Beauregard, I'm sorry, I need that Confederate cavalry group that I was going to send you. So you're kind of on your own. Use what home guard you can find. There may be some soldiers returning from not re-enlisting that you can find, but otherwise you're on your own.
Probably take
That's
some
crazy.
out of the hospitals, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's, here we are just, April 5th, April 6th, and the Confederate government has been in Danville for several days now. They're established. They're organized. We know Sherman's coming up from the south. We know that there's an active Union raid going on in southwest Virginia and Tennessee. And here sits Danville unguarded, and the Confederate Army refuses to, guard them.
Does the Union know that they are in Danville? Like, that's where they're consolidated to?
That's an interesting story. I think the Union soldiers figure it out, and we'll talk about that here in just a second.
Just kind of guess. That's the only available option.
I think they figure out what's there, and they they lead on that they kind of know what's there, but for some reason they never attack it. But like I said, we'll get to that here in just a second. So, they're going back and forth. Beauregard's not happy because Danville's left unguarded, and that falls in his territory. Like if Danville's attacked and
That's his fault.
yeah, it's that he's in charge of that territory. So
Right.
all the blame is going to fall on him. Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? So, I don't know if James Wheeler, who's coming down from the Lynchburg area, had a change of heart, but he says, or mentally he says, I'm going to go screen and just make sure that there's nothing coming to Danville's area. I know that Lee is on the east side of Danville, so he's their barrier there. I'm coming from the north. There's nothing here. Johnson's at the south, so I'm going to ride a little bit to the west of Danville, and I'm going to make sure that there's nothing there. When Wheeler rides west of Danville, he camps out in Henry Courthouse, which is present-day Martinsville, and he stays there overnight on a little place called Jones Creek. And when he sets up his camp, people from the area hear that he's there, and Danville and Martinsville are very Southern sympathizers. They love the Confederate cause. The Home Guard comes out and joins him. They're saying, hey, Confederate soldiers in the area, keep in mind, they haven't seen the war there. Mm-hmm. So the Home Guard comes out and they're like, hey, we're here for you. We'll help you any way you need. So Wheeler says, okay, can you all scout the area just to see, make sure nothing's out there. Go, ride out all the directions, make sure nothing's there, then come back and report to me. There's a group that leaves from Jones Creek, and they go a little bit west to where Reed Creek meets the Smith River, which is in present-day like Stanleytown area. And they come across a detachment of George Stoneman's cavalry. And they ride back, and they say, well, Stoneman's cavalry's here. So what do you want us to do? And they tell Wheeler that he's totally outmanned, that he's not going to win a fight against them. So Wheeler doesn't act on it. It's nighttime. He said, we're just going to, stay here. We're not going to do anything. But little did they know that the Union soldiers had also sent out scouts and were planning to attack in the morning. I'm going to backtrack a bit here and talk about Stoneman himself, because Stoneman often gets overlooked in this. So George Stoneman has had an interesting Civil War career up to this point. Stoneman, ironically enough, was West Point roommates with Stonewall Jackson. So Stonewall and Stoneman were roommates. And Stoneman's been put in various command positions, but every time he's been put in a command position of prominence, he has totally bungled it. Mm-hmm. He's tried to do more than he's asked, and the historian side of me says that it's because he was trying to capture some of that glory that his roommate had. Yeah, he was trying to always go. He wanted to make a name for himself too. Stonewall and Stoneman has a good ring to it. Like at Chancellorsville, he develops this plan to attack Lee from behind, but he can't because the creeks have swelled and he can't cross the river. So now there's a part of Hooker's army that is off by itself now. Mm-hmm. He's the next year is given a task to raid Andersonville prison and free the prisoners. He changes the plan to the last minute. Doesn't work.
Just trying to add his spin on things.
Right. He's trying to make himself the hero in this, but it doesn't work. So here at the war's end, Stoneman is under the command of George Thomas at this point. George Thomas is in East Tennessee in like the Knoxville, Morristown area. And Grant tells Thomas, hey, tell Stoneman, take his cavalry and go and cut all the rail lines, destroy the supply depots, and make sure Lee cannot be reinforced by anything from Southwest Virginia. We've taken care of the Shenandoah Valley, but make sure he cannot have anything from Southwest Virginia. So Grant tells Thomas this in the fall of 1864. Stoneman at this point says, I don't think we're ready. And he just kind of sits there. So he sits there for the fall. He sits there for the winter. And the start of spring comes in March. And Grant sends a message to Thomas, why hasn't Stoneman started yet? I'm about to destroy Lee. I need somebody to close in on that side of Virginia. Make sure, and this is almost word for word from the record, make sure Stoneman has everything he needs so he can leave immediately. So Thomas kind of lights a fire under Stoneman, and Stoneman leaves what is present-day Morristown, Tennessee, which is the last town on the exits right before you get to Pigeon Forge. And he heads up what is now I-81 and Route 11 heading into Tennessee, cutting rail lines, destroying supply depots, all the way up into Virginia, through Bristol, through Abingdon, all the way up through Wytheville, and he ends up in a little town called Big Lick, which is now what we call Roanoke. And he kind of splits there, and part of his forces go to Lynchburg, and part of his forces go into Hillsville, and a little place called Jacksonville, which is now called Floyd, Virginia, and a little place called Taylorsville, which is now called Stewart, Virginia.
They changed all the names of the towns back then.
Yep.
Back down there too.
Yep.
Wow.
And so the detachment that went towards Lynchburg ends up coming kind of down through Rocky Mount, which is kind of out of the way, but they come down through Rocky Mount and they head down towards Henry Courthouse. And their main mission is destroy everything they can at Henry Courthouse, excuse me, and then head south towards Winston-Salem because there is a Confederate factory. I think they make uniforms in Winston-Salem. So they end up in Henry Courthouse, present-day Martinsville, on the night of April 7th, 1865. And then, lo and behold, they run into a Confederate cavalry group just a few miles away from them. So in the morning of April 8th, they engage in a very quick skirmish on what's like I said today, Jones Creek. It lasts about an hour, but at the end of that hour, 5 Union soldiers are dead. 1 Confederate soldier is dead. But the Union force is so large, it drives the Confederates from the field, and the Confederates retreat about 15 miles east to the present-day county line between Henry and Pennsylvania County. And Wheeler sends a telegram to Beauregard that says, let's see, the enemy attacked me at 7 a.m. today. After a spirited fight, they were repulsed with several losses on their side. Their prisoners that we captured report Stoneman is at Christiansburg, and he has sent troops on several roads, all of which are to concentrate on Danville.
So they know at that point.
Yeah. So Stoneman Stoneman has told his men that Danville is the goal. And when they are kind of wrapping things up after the battle, because keep in mind the Confederate forces have retreated, the Union forces set up kind of like a makeshift field hospital in some of the houses that are in Martinsville and the courthouse plaza area today. They are taking food and stuff from the Martinsville residents, and they're telling people, we're going to Danville. That's our next stop, which is about 20 miles to the east, which for cavalry, what's that, like 2-3 hours, tops.
Right.
Yeah.
Of a ride.
Does this battle have a name?
No, it's just known as the skirmish at Jones Creek. I don't think anybody's ever given it a name.
Well, go ahead, Jared. Yeah. This is your chance.
The skirmish at Jones Creek.
So plain. So plain.
I was thinking that too.
The Battle of Martinsville.
There you go.
But yeah, so Stoneman's men are telling, Henry County residents, keep in mind, this is on April 8th, 1865. This is the morning of April 8th, 1865, that they are going to head east about 20 miles, which, like I said, on cavalry can be done in a couple hours. And there's already an established road there, the Danville Wytheville Turnpike, which is Route 58 today.
This is the same day that Wise visits.
Right. Wise visits Davis that night. So
this is the morning.
Yeah, that morning, a detachment of Stoneman's cavalry is 20 miles away from an unguarded Danville. And that, to me, is the fascinating story in all of this.
Is he aware of that?
I think Stoneman knows it. I don't know if Davis knows it. and I think Davis is better off not knowing it. But this to me is one of the greatest what ifs of the Civil War. I know, as historians, we're not supposed to play what ifs, but you can't help but think about, okay, Stoneman has been greedy many times before. What if he, and obviously we know by his reports that his men know that he wants Danville. What if Stoneman just says, well, what if I just ride east and just check out Danville? I mean, it is literally the next town over. I'm not totally going out of my way. What if I go there and just see what's there? Stoneman could capture Davis, the cabinet, the treasury, and the war ends April 8th.
But logistically, if they don't know that Davis is in Danville, wouldn't they need to go north? Because they know, I'm assuming they know Lee's at Appomattox or near Appomattox Courthouse.
Would be
like
east.
as the army, is that east?
More east, kind of northeast.
Yeah.
Northeast. Yeah. Well, northeast. Though.
But I would still say Stoneman, even if he went to Danville, I mean, there's a railroad hub there. So
right.
his goal is to beat that.
Yeah, he knows that there are rations there, and, he can resupply there, but he can also, come away holding the bag, essentially. Like, look what I did.
Bagging Davis, yeah.
Right.
I hate the what ifs, but they are kind of fun sometimes.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, if he had just taken it upon himself to, act on his own volition one more time, the war could have ended April.
So he's told not to go to Danville?
Well, I think he realized that the war was ending. Again, this is personal speculation, but I think he realized that the war was ending, and he wanted to end the war on a positive note that he could
Followed orders.
Yeah, he could set himself up for the future because he wasn't old enough to retire yet. So he was going to set himself up for a nicer command. That he was just going to follow orders.
And he's already done all these risks prior to that.
Right. So
why now?
Why,
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
So
why now the war's almost
The
over.
irony of it.
Right. So
And
He could have single-handedly
yeah, because like I said, literally Danville was unguarded. They didn't have earthworks.
It wouldn't have ended the war, but
it'd have put a big dent in
ah,
it.
damn it, we're doing the what ifs. I can't
We're
do
doing
it.
it.
But I mean, it's interesting to think about. What if Danville is Appomattox? Like, what if Lee doesn't get a chance to surrender because his president is being held hostage?
I can't do it, Jared. I can't. Keep going. I can't do it.
So
That would definitely change
so
So what happens after this?
all right. Again, Wise tells Davis and the cabinet that Lee is going to surrender in the next 24 to 48 hours, which we know he does the very next morning at Appomattox. Davis says that if he's going to surrender, then we can't stay here too much longer. We have to get out.
Yeah.
So fortunately, they hadn't totally unloaded the trains yet. So they put what they had took off back on the trains, and they headed south towards Greensboro.
So Danville was as a capital for
1 week.
okay 1 week.
Yeah.
From the what
So I
second
guess-
to the
Yeah, technically the
final
the third to the ninth. Yeah,
It's kind of final official capital,
yeah.
right?
It's the final official capital. That's the last place that the Confederate government sets up, and that's where Davis issues his final official proclamation.
He holds a cabinet meeting in Charlotte, but it's not like they're not established as a government there. They're just it's just a quick meeting.
Right.
Danville's from April 3rd to when?
April 9th. He leaves on the morning of April 9th. And apparently, Stoneman does know more than he lets on, because as Davis is heading south towards Greensboro, he crosses the bridge at a place called Brown Summit, North Carolina, which is just on the north side of Greensboro. And Stoneman's men show up to destroy the bridge just as Davis is crossing it. Like, Stoneman's men show up and they see the train crossing.
Oh my goodness. So then they
Very close.
Stillman knew.
Yeah, he knew. Now, Stoneman, after he... Stoneman is actually never in Martinsville. Stoneman's detachment, which is led by Colonel William Palmer, who goes on to found the city of Colorado Springs, Colorado, later on in years.
Fun fact.
Yeah, fun fact. Throw in there. Stoneman is actually... He spends his whole time in Taylorsville, which is Stewart. He's kind of commanding from there. Stoneman sends word from Taylorsville to William Palmer to meet him in a place called Danbury, North Carolina, which is a very small town today. And the forces come back together, then they ride south towards Winston-Salem. But Stoneman knew. Because like I said,
there's no doubt.
yeah,
Well, if he's not even in Martinsville or is it Henry County?
Yeah.
Henry Courthouse. If he's not even there and he's giving orders or making statements that are the goal is Danville, he had to have done something.
yeah.
So.
I think he did, but again, he knew that with Lee on the move, with Sherman coming up, the war is going to be over, and I don't want to be known as the guy who struck out 3 times.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, because if he doesn't get Davis, if he goes and makes that raid and doesn't get Davis and stuff,
And
he just looks like an idiot.
And
I guess.
And Grant told him specifically, do these things. Like, so do you want to disobey your orders from Grant? You know, so, but again, not thinking about what ifs, but Danville was totally left unguarded with everything there, and the Union Army is 20 miles away.
Yeah. Wow.
So, and I guess kind of a footnote for this as we wrap up. Danville, because of all the hecticness from moving from Richmond to Danville for a week, and then the train picks up and leaves and goes to Greensboro, where Davis stays for a few days before he heads south to Salisbury and then south again to Charlotte. This is where a lot of the Confederate lost treasure people speculate that
The
gold is. And now I will tell you the facts of this. I'm not going to go into speculation because there's people who have spent lots of hours and written books about where the treasure is. When they loaded the trains in Richmond, they did an inventory of what all went on the trains. So they had a record of what all went on the trains. Things were very crazy in Danville. They didn't have time to do inventory in Danville. They did inventory again once they got to Greensboro. And somewhere between Richmond and Greensboro, 12 kegs of Mexican silver went missing. So 12 barrels of Mexican silver went missing somewhere between Richmond and Greensboro. And that's all I'm going to say about that.
Sounds like a challenge.
So, like I said, those are the facts. I'm not going to feed into any speculation. But
All right, boys, we're going treasure hunting.
Just saying, it sounds like a good
National
time.
Treasure 3. Let's do it.
It sounds like a good idea
So,
for a trip.
the reason I'm passionate about this though is again not the what ifs, because that's certainly part of it. But I grew up in Danville, so I grew up seeing the last Confederate Capitol House. Every time we went to Danville, because it's right there on Main Street.
Yeah.
Like it isn't. It's right there. 2 blocks down from the hospital.
Isn't that amazing that a week of use of a property is what makes it what it is for all time?
And there's still there are people still who still label it the last capital.
Like the Confederacy.
And they up until recently were still flying the stars and bars.
Wow.
Out in front. But I grew up seeing this house several times a week because my family and I would go to this little mom and pop grocery store near there, which is next to a cemetery where John Hunt Morgan's daughter is buried, but that's a different discussion for a different day. But I grew up seeing this house, and if you see a picture of it, it's now the Danville Museum of Fine Arts and History. This house looks different than any other house because when you think like old Victorian style houses, they're elaborate, they got the wooden trim and stuff. This looks like a brown castle. So I grew up asking people like, why is this house the way it is? Why is this house different? Why does this house have, this gate around it and they're flying the Confederate flag? And people are like, oh, well, that's why, that's where the Davis spent the last week of the Civil War. And as a young kid, I was like, okay, that's fine. That's pretty cool. The Civil War happened here in my hometown.
Yeah.
But as I grew up, I'm like, okay, why they come to Danville? Because Danville,
you start asking the questions.
Yeah, because
that's what makes you a good historian,
right? Because Danville, I mean, when I was growing up, this was a post-factory era Danville, post-factory, and I guess now pre-casino.
There's a casino in Danville.
You haven't heard?
Is this happening?
Yeah.
We'll talk after the show.
Yeah,
Keep going.
Yeah, this is definitely a post podcast discussion. But anyway, but like Danville, like if you wanted to go to like Sam's Club, you had to go to like Lynchburg or Greensboro or Roanoke, aka outside of Danville. So like, why'd they come to Danville? Like I was a young kid, I wanted out of Danville because Danville wasn't fun, and people are saying, well, that was the last rail line that was, still operable, between here and Richmond. I was like, okay, so that makes sense. So he came to Danville because he had to, like most people do. And then as I got older, I'm like, okay, why that line? And then, once you start learning about things like the Wilson Couts raid and about how they strongly defended the Stanton River Bridge, which was the Richmond and Danville line, there were constant attacks on the Richmond and Danville line, which is why I say that Danville was the main supplier of Lee's army, at least while he was in Virginia, because people knew how important that line was. And you could ride the train from Danville to Burkeville, and at Burkeville there was a junction where you could go to Petersburg, or you can keep going to Richmond, or you could change and go to Lynchburg. I mean, Danville was the major rail hub of Southside Virginia. So that's why, like I say, if nothing else, the Wilson Couch raid just confirms that
100%
that line was that important.
Mm-hmm. Well, I found it interesting too with that with Danville itself. It doesn't actually see a big battle or anything, but those people are seeing the horrors of war, having the hospitals there. Correct. And the prisoner of war camps are seeing the disease, are seeing the death, the limbs being chopped off, and things like that from these horrific battles that are happening east of them. So they are very touched by the war, right? In a different way.
I think from 1863 to 1865, you had somewhere around 3,000 to 3,500 Union soldiers die in prisons in Danville.
Wow.
Which is why there's a national cemetery there.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little more for folks that want to travel and visit these sites that we just talked about. What can they see? And to you as a native, kind of give a behind-the-scenes take on it.
So if you go to Danville, you can still go to the Sutherland Mansion, which is where Davis spent his week when he was in Danville. Excuse me. You can still go. They have the room sealed off where he hosted his cabinet meetings, and they have the desk where he signed his last proclamation. Like, that's still preserved exactly the way it was.
Who runs that?
Currently, it's the Danville Museum of Fine Arts and History. So there's a history museum up top, and they have arts, all throughout it downstairs. So like this museum runs.
It's a local site though.
Right. Okay. It's local. But the UDC, the Daughters of Confederacy, own that room. I don't know how they got special access to own that room, but they seal it off except for when they have their meetings up there.
The UDC has like magical wizard power.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
It's beyond me. So you can go from there literally straight down Main Street, and then you take a right, and you'll come into what's called the Warehouse District. And all the warehouses that they use for prisons are still standing. You can go to them. There's a couple Civil War trail signs.
They're very cool.
Out front of them. You can't go in them because obviously they've been transformed since then. If you go east of Danville towards the airport, you can see the earthworks that were dug. They're still there. There's a Civil War trail sign for that. And you can do a lot of reading if you want to dive into some books, because there's tons of them out there about the houses that each person stayed in. Like this cabinet member stayed here, like John C. Breckinridge stayed here.
So it really breaks down that week.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. So like, they'll say like, the post office was here, or like the postmaster general like ran the post office out of here, and the War Department was run out of this house. And
silly question. What was John C. Breckinridge on the cabinet?
He was Secretary of War at that point.
When was he in that position?
Was it 65?
Yeah,
early 65.
Early 65.
Yeah, he was appointed at the very end.
Maybe March, I think.
Yeah.
Excuse my ignorance. I just didn't know.
No.
So.
Yeah.
Because, he's in the field.
He's in the field up until.
That's cool.
I think it's March of 65.
Because he's fighting with Early for.
He's at
64.
Yep. Well,
I
don't think he's at Cedar Creek, but
he's at.
No,
he's
not. I think he's sent south after 3rd. I don't even think he's at Fisher's Hill. But that's
he's at 3rd Winchester, though.
100%.
Yeah.
So different.
Yeah. So those are some sites you can see in Danville. If people want to reach out to me at the Blue and Gray Education Society, I'll be glad to tell them some more. There is a Civil War trail sign in Martinsville to signify the skirmish, but it's at the wrong spot.
Oh.
It's in front of the old courthouse, which is in Uptown Martinsville. I guess they put it there because it gets somewhat better visitation.
Yeah.
But the site where the skirmish happened, and I just put out a short about this on our YouTube channel. It's now one of the busiest intersections in Martinsville. Like there's a church there, and there's a quick lube auto place.
Yeah.
Like, it's completely grown up, and there's nothing there to show what happened.
Let's change that.
Yeah, I agree.
Very good short, by the way.
Thank you.
Like that.
And so, and I guess this is what I'll wrap up with. Those 6 soldiers who passed away, they were buried in a church cemetery that's in Martinsville. They were buried there for a couple years, but once the National Cemetery got started in Danville, the 5 Union soldiers were exhumed and moved there. And I think 4 out of the 5 are buried as unknown. Even though we know their names, we don't know which one was which because the bodies had gone beyond recognition. The one Confederate soldier was moved to the city cemetery called Oakwood in Martinsville, and if you go there today, there's a headstone. It doesn't have his name because we don't know who, or his name was lost over time, but it's the headstone reads, "The last blood shed for the lost cause." So that's where that soldier is buried. But yeah, so one of the things that fascinates me about history is like people drive by there. I mean, thousands of cars drive by this intersection every day and don't know that 6 soldiers died right there.
Yeah.
And then put that in perspective for the larger story. And I don't know. It just
taken for granted.
Yeah.
It's taken for
It's
granted.
something so small, but it was so massive at the same time. I mean, we talked about it with our guest, Jonathan Noyalis, on the Cool Spring episode. I mean, these battles, these engagements were, small in our eyes, statistically, numerically, things like that. But the fact of the matter is, if it was their biggest battle for them.
Correct.
Yeah, each one has its own importance.
Yeah.
There's a reason it was fought.
So-
There's a reason it happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're impactful. So yeah. It's what's the preservation of the area besides the house? I mean, with these sites, none.
Not really. There's a couple Civil War trail signs in Danville, but the warehouses, some of them have been torn down, but the ones that are still standing have since been like
Adaptive reuse.
adaptive reuse. The earthworks are now the city farm. So you can't get to them anymore. I mentioned Martinsville. Yeah, it's totally
So
grown.
not too much when it comes to just the Capitol kind of building.
Yeah,
and a lot of interpretation, but preservation.
If you were to stop there and go see one thing, I would go see the mansion.
For sure.
Yeah,
For sure. Are the rail lines still operating?
They are.
That's exciting. Yeah, that's cool. I remember going on a tour with the great historian Zach Pittard of Pamphlet Historical Society at Stanton River Bridge. I remember him telling a story because that's the rail lines there is no longer operating. And he pointed out, I think when Davis was headed across that line towards Danville, him getting off there and stopping and talking with the home guard that I think was still on guard there. So it's a really neat story to kind of tie it in full picture that he ends up there.
And one more thing from Martinsville that not a lot of people know about, and like when I give this presentation, I don't tell this part. So again, this is a Battlefields and Bourbon exclusive here.
We appreciate it.
So after Jubal Early loses at Waynesboro, he heads south towards Martinsville, where his cousins live. He has a strong contingent of cousins there. Their last name is Harston, which is where we get the last name Hairston from. It's spelled the same, just one's the white family with the Scottish pronunciation, one's the black family that pronounces it Hairston. And Jubal Early is kind of like resting and recuperating at his cousin's house in Martinsville, a place called Beaver Creek. And if you go to Google and type in Henry County, Virginia, and you see a picture of a white house, that's the Beaver Creek house. Once it's known that Union soldiers are just a few miles down the road, because where they're camped at is, as the crow flies, about 1.5 miles from the Beaver Creek house. One of the Beaver Creek plantation slaves comes and tells Jubal Early that he has to get out right now because the Union Army, if they find him there, they're basically going to skin him alive. So Jubal Early has to get up and flee to one of the neighboring plantations that's out of harm's way, and he's doing this as all this is going on.
Wow.
So Early is there during all of this.
The fact that there's, an
nothing he
enslaved
can
person that warns him too.
Yeah.
At that time
That's
of the
such
war,
Yeah, that's such an interesting.
Yeah, so
something we could dive deeper on. But
so yeah,
wow.
so giving y'all's valid connection, I thought I'd throw in something early related. But yeah,
Well, we appreciate
Early
that.
Early was there in Martinsville as this skirmish happened.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's pretty cool.
Well, Jarred, as as the membership kind of director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, we talked about folks being able to become members and all those membership dues and what they support, the mission, furthering the mission, interpretation, preservation, restoration, things like that you all do. Talk a little bit about the tour opportunities, where they can get educated at, where our listeners can get out in the field, get hands-on with these historians and actually go to these places.
Sure. If you go to our website at blueandgrayeducation.org, you can go check out our tour schedule. Our tours take you to places that many people stop at, but not a lot of people go into the depth that we do. So, you may go to Chickamauga, but you may stop at like the audio tour sites. Mm-hmm. Like our tours, you will walk the battlefield and, go into the woods. You will see what they saw, and as opposed to just being told, things at different stops. We do our tours with authors and subject matter experts. For example, one of our next tours is going through Rome, Georgia, and Cassville, Georgia, with a guy named Bob Jenkins. Bob just wrote the book, from Dalton to Cassville. So he literally wrote the book on the subject. We have tours coming up with Scott Patchen. He's doing one on Grant's 1864 campaign from Lynchburg. Very subject matter expert. We have one coming up here in a few months about the career of Albert Sidney Johnson, who's very much an overlooked Civil War person. Mm-hmm. With Tim Smith, Tim Smith wrote what is now, I think, the seminal work on Vicksburg.
Yeah.
So you get to go walk the battlefields and hear from these people directly.
That know it more than anyone else alive today.
Done a ton of research.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. It's y'all have said on here before, it's one thing to read a book about it, and it's one thing to watch videos on it. But once you're actually standing on that battlefield and walking it with somebody who knows exactly what they're talking about and literally wrote the book on it, it's something different, and that's what Blue and Gray can offer.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Jarred, thank you so much for coming on. We appreciate you being here, giving your expertise, but also Blue and Gray Education Society just being a great supporter of the podcast. So thank you again for coming on and doing this with us, sitting around for an hour and talking
thank you.
Civil War. We do enjoy it. And thank you, Aaron, from Aaron Civil War Travels, for coming on. You can find him on Facebook and YouTube and any other social medias. He also has a website as well, so you can get some private tours from him and some talks on there. So we thank you all so much for listening. Don't forget to give us 5 stars, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Thank you.